community, even though it was a real small community, we didn't interact with white people a lot. Not at the elementary level. We kind of played together as blacks, and they played wherever they played, and there was not a lot of interaction that happened at that time in our community. And even when we got up into junior high, we went to school together, but then we didn't really socialize together that much after school. And that's kind of interesting. And the elementary school playground, Mount Elementary School, after school, it became the place where the African Americans went, and we played basketball there. And very seldom would Caucasians come up here and play. It's kind of ironic as I think about it. And as I got into high school, it started to change a bit. There started to be a little more interaction. But in elementary and junior high, there wasn't.
Thank you.
Except doing athletics. Mm-hmm. Except in athletic contests, then you kind of came together, and athletics played a major part, I think, of maybe building race relations and building friendships.
When you were in high school, do you remember how were the experiences going to like a football game or basketball game?
Yeah, again, I think that sports, as I said earlier, it became a venue, and it provided, a backdrop for people to come together and work together, where there was at least the appearance of equality and fairness. By that I mean that the rules of the game required there to be certain amount of integrity. So sports played a very, very important role in the lives of African American boys in Mount Hope and in most communities that I knew in southern West Virginia, because it was a place where you could earn some validation. Everybody wanted to win, and football was very important in southern West Virginia, and it still is today. It's important in West Virginia. So everybody wanted to win. And so the African Americans, of course, were allowed to play and allowed to participate almost on an equal footing. And I'll say almost because there was still some racism and prejudice and discrimination that was reserved. A lot of schools like Mount Hope was reluctant to let an African American play the position of quarterback. They're reluctant to have an all African American backfield, okay, on the football team. My cousin, my late cousin, he just passed away a few months ago, was the first African American to play quarterback, at Mount Hope High School, and he was outstanding. I think he led him to maybe a couple of state championships. But after he left, he was like Superman, and there was a reluctance to let an African American play a position. I mean, it was obvious; everybody knew it, but it was not something you could do anything about. And on the basketball court, there was a reluctance to let 5 blacks play at the same time. So these things were practiced, and people could see it, and people knew it, but you accepted it as the way it was, and there wasn't a lot you could do about it.
Was that because that had anything to do with either like the coach not wanting them on it, or is it parents, or is it pushback from the school, or a little bit of everything?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think there was a certain amount of pressure. There was groups like, the Lions Club, and they were to make sure that their children was represented, in athletic teams in various prestigious positions. And so I think it was a combination of both. And it was a combination of just the historic segregation and the racism that was kind of woven into the fabric and the culture of the society, not just Mount Hope, but most of West Virginia that I knew anything about. But we got along fairly well together. Where the big rub was that there was a reluctance, a strong reluctance, to have an African American female as a cheerleader or as a majorette. There was strong resistance to that. And I remember when I was maybe in late elementary or early junior high, possibly, there was my boyhood pastor, Pastor James Thompson, who was a great man and committed to fairness and social justice. He was creating this conversation, right, as to why is it our boys can play in disproportionate numbers on the football field, but our girls are not allowed to be cheerleaders or majorettes. And he was really calling for blacks to really seriously think about boycotting and not playing. That type of statement had to be made. And finally, there was, a black cheerleader. One of my sisters, Anita, was one of the first black cheerleaders. She wasn't the first, one of the first black at the junior high level. And then I think she was a cheerleader every year in high school. And then finally there was a few African American females that were allowed to be majorettes. That was kind of one of the last vestiges, right, of overt exclusion that happened in the context, of the public school.
Did you ever go to the dances at all when you were in high school?
Yes, I did.
What were those experiences like?
Well, probably until I got in high school, they were segregated. I mean, you would go and the blacks would be over here and they would be dancing over here and the whites would be dancing over here. So if you look at like the 60s and 70s, right, well, interracial dating was not something that was that popular. It was something that created no small stir in our town. And that was one of the things that could get you ran away from uptown, as we called it, where the movie theater was, right? That the white guys would run us out of town if they thought, we were looking at, the Caucasian females. So there was a lot of tension over that issue at the time. So that it was not something that was overt. I'm sure there was some dating taking place, but it was pretty secret. I remember fights. I remember some pretty serious confrontations happening over, an African American male, having a white girlfriend. It was pretty serious. Not only there, but again, in other places as well. Things are a lot different today than what I knew growing up in the 60s and in the 70s. Very different.
So when you got in, so you had a little bit of African American history education in elementary school, and then you went into the high school. Did you still get? Did that transfer a little bit, or is that
almost
pretty much gone?
Almost none until I think I was in the 11th or 12th grade. I can't recall. That we had kind of talked about it, and stirred some stuff up. And an African American literature teacher, Mrs. Blonzetta Walker, she had taken the initiative to get a Black History class introduced that she would teach. And there was a handful of us blacks that took it, there may have been a Caucasian. I can't remember if I don't remember any Caucasians being in the class. But we took it. She was a good teacher. We learned some things. It was exciting time, right? This was coming, civil rights movement had kind of happened. It had peaked, So now we're talking about the early 70s, but still Martin Luther King's aura was still there, people still talking about, Malcolm X, who had gotten killed in the early 60s, 63, I believe. King had gotten killed in 68. And so there was a lot of things that were going on. The 68 Olympics when John Carlos and Tommy Smith had raised their fists, the Black Power thing was going on. So there's a lot of things was going on that was just kind of getting to West Virginia. I always tell people, like, the civil rights movement never really got here. We watched it on television. We observed it. We were spectators. We really weren't participants, really. There were some things that happened down here in Charleston, but we didn't really see it in my little community. As I said before, Brown v. Board, 1954. I started school 8 years later, 1962. They're still segregated by race. Civil Rights Act, 1964, right? We lived in a public housing projects, moved in 1963, segregated by race. My mom moved in 66, segregated by race. We stayed there into 1973, they're still segregated by race. So it doesn't look like the civil rights movement was really hitting that little pocket of southern West Virginia. But it wasn't, it wasn't what can I say? Again, my childhood and being born out in my community was wonderful. Yes, we got called the N word. Yes, we got rocked out of certain parts of the town. I carried newspapers from the time I was about 9 or 10, and I would have my customers to leave the money, as many of them would, if they would do it, leave the money under the mat on the door, because I carried newspapers early in the morning, because I didn't want to have to go back in the evenings. And my route was what was called uptown. And the uptown was where the Caucasians lived, and that's where they kind of ruled that part of the town. And some of the guys up there didn't even like us coming up there, being uptown. And every time they would rock me, they would, and we would go to movie theater in groups. Normally we would go on Saturdays during the day or on Sundays during the day, because there would be a problem if we went at night. We would run out, we'd have to run from uptown out of the movie theater. There wasn't a swimming pool, there were just swimming holes, right? Abandoned coal mines where water's running down, it creates a pool of water. We had these little, in rural communities like that. And it was owned, I think, by the railroad, the property. It wasn't nobody's private property. And that's where we would go and swim. But inadvertently, if we would be there swimming, they wouldn't be there. But we'd be there at the time, they would rock us. They would throw rocks at us. It was dangerous. Like, someone could have gotten hurt badly because we couldn't see. The swimming hole was down off of the railroad tracks, walked down this little path, trees was all over the place. And so you couldn't see, and so they could be on the high ground throwing rocks down at us, and we'd be grabbing our clothes and trying to run and get away from up there. Those little things, that they were more than annoyances, right? They sent the signal, I think that they were intended to send. You guys are not equal to us. We control everything. We own everything, and even something we don't own, we own it. And you're allowed to participate at our will and our pleasure. So some of us had choices, and we made choices, right, in terms of how we would deal with that. Some of my friends were a little more angry than what I was, and maybe a little more bitter. And I think I was more angry and more bitter than whatever I admitted, or whatever I would say. But I just decided to internalize it, right, and to channel it into competition. Academic competition, athletic competition, to demonstrate that that I could compete against anybody, anywhere, in any venue. So that's the way I personally chose, to handle that. And to be honest, I think it worked in my advantage. I tell people often, I feel like I receive unearned privilege. Athletes always receive unearned privilege. Outstanding athletes always receive unearned privilege. There's an infatuation that people have with athletes at every level, right? And being a fellow Eastern athlete, I think that I was accepted more than some of my friends were, and being a pretty good student.